And 2 questions from Dr. Barton. Basically, one on each topic. Cardiovascular, I don't know. I gotta make it hard, so I don't know. Anyway, I'll post that by the way. And it should be the question, the short answer, all short answer, of course, and it should take about 15 minutes. All right, so that's the beginning. Yes?
Will there be questions, or we choose
Maybe in cardiovascular. Maybe. Yes?
What about muscle?
I'm sorry?
Muscle?
Yeah, there'll be a question on muscle. One question on muscle. All right? So last day we tried to get the point across. Most of the peripheral resistance is localized in the arterial system, and I'll show you this diagram here, saying the biggest pressure drop due to frictional losses is the level of the arterial. These guys are important in maintaining a normal blood pressure, so if you lose this resistance, of course, the blood pressure will drop. If the individual is hypertensive, of course, high blood pressure, one of the treatments for this, of course, is to reduce that resistance pharmacologically. And, of course, you work on this guy here primarily. So, everybody here is taking physical 10, something along those lines. And you can look at this model, kind of like a bunch of series of resistances and a volt. So we're talking, and we're now using the analogy we were talking about pressure and flow. The flow for this whole system is, of course, the cardiac output. It doesn't change. It's everything. But if you look at the drops across these resistors, or vascular resistances, of course, there's going to be a little drop across the major arteries. You're going to lose a little bit of energy there from that mean arterial pressure of 100. When you get to the level of the arterial, you get the major drop because that's the highest resistance in the circulation flow. And please remember that the cardiac output goes to the whole system. You're going to get some drop through the capillaries and venules and veins. And by the time you get to the right atrium, the blood pressure should drop, or the pressure should drop to almost 0, and the right atrium pressure is very close to 0. So basically, this is showing another way of looking at how the resistance. So if this resistance increases, if you're hypertensive, then of course the back pressure out here will increase as well. If you drop it too much, as you might if you lose sympathetic tone, then across the whole blood pressure system will drop substantially. So it depends a lot on the arterioles, and that's the reason, the location of the highest part of the systemic resistance. So that's a function of the arterioles. Sometimes in normal function, good, doesn't mean it gives you blood pressure. And it gets to be a little older and a lot of stresses, a lot of states, marble states to say the least. It's probably resistances, will of course.
It's really bright. It's really bright. You should turn off the lights. No, no, no. So, no. Yeah.
Oh, everybody's in the dark room.
He was like, oh, sorry. No. Yeah. Yes.
Anyway, so now that we're finished with the arterial, the resistance is there, that's what you got to know. Major drop this in the level arterioles to get sympathetic input to maintain that resistance. And that's important. The other thing that's kind of, now we get to the level of the capillaries. I told you there's 3 different kinds. There's the continuous capillary, which is in muscle, guts, etc., etc. There's the fenestrated ones, which are in the kidney, and you're going to learn a lot about those in the second term. And finally, last but not least, is the sinusoidal ones for bone marrow, liver, a few places like that. There's big holes in them, so red blood cells can move in and out, that kind of stuff. But the exchange, and one of the important things that's been in physiology for a long time, is the transcapillary exchange largely of water, and it's called ultrafiltration, and this is important because in the maintenance of fluid balance between the blood and the interstitial fluid. So there's a balance there. So that's referred to as Starling's hypothesis. Old Starling, a long time ago, did a lot of things. I'm not sure why it's a hypothesis, but it's actually true. But that's textbook still referred to as Starling's hypothesis. The other process is, of course, diffusion. And you get a lot of diffusion of blood gases, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and it's responsible for the exchange of nutrients and metabolic waste, and the diffusion is a big process in the capillary system. But the one we're going to focus on is the ultrafiltration part, because that provides for fluid balance between the capillaries, or the circulation, and the interstitial fluid. This is a picture of 2 endothelial cells. The capillaries are made up of a tube, simply a tube of endothelial cells. Endothelial cells line all blood vessels, so when you get down to the capillary, everything else disappears, and you're left with this sort of tube of endothelial cells. This is the lumen. So that's the inside, and this is interstitial space, and this is the junction between 2 endothelial cells. Not a great picture, but it shows that there are little strands or something between each individual cells. And in actual fact, these are tight junctions, little protein connections, and you have them on all the continuous capillaries. In muscle and most other locations, these tight junctions are, there's a few of them around. You can actually, you see your notes, you'll actually see some sort of look like protein strands tying the 2 endothelial cells together. And in the case of the blood-brain barrier, in the brain, you're also continuous capillaries. There's a lot more of these, so this is really tight in the brain. That forms a blood-brain barrier. In muscle and other locations, of course, it's not as tight. So these tight junctions are, in fact, depending on where the location of the capillary network is, will be tight in the blood-brain barrier. There's a lot more of them, and skeletal muscle a lot less. So that gives one pathway for the movement of water, small molecules in continuous capillaries. The other thing that's been lately, there's been a lot of some work done on the fact that you have a transcellular route or paracellular route through the membranes through water channels. And these are called active porins, and the one that's been shown is active porin 1, and it's simply a channel that lets water go from one side or the other. So you have active porin channels here, and here water can actually move through. So you have 2 pathways. In most capillaries within the blood-brain barrier, this is more or less closed off, and water has to move through these water channels. They're very sparse apparently. So this is the way water can actually move in and out of the capillary, and some small molecules. Large molecules move through some sort of a shuttle system apparently, so they can actually move through the cell wall, and the cell wall here, some sort of a shuttle system that may actually get some movement of large molecules. But in general, what comes out of here is things like sugars, glucose, etc., etc. Oxygen and carbon dioxide retrieved through the membrane. Okay, so this is the pathways for movement of water. And what we're going to give you a model where we're going to take one chunk of the capillary, just one continuous capillary starting at the end of the arterial. And in skeletal muscle, you probably don't have precapillary sphincters, and they only occur primarily in the GI tract. Muscle doesn't usually have them, so we'll ignore these guys here. Anyway, this is one continuous capillary, and we'll look at the fluid balance across this blood vessel. So we're talking about little starting electrolyte. Capillary filtration, the starting hypothesis, simply states the direction and magnitude of movement of water across the capillary wall is determined by the algebraic sum of hydrostatic pressures and osmotic pressures across the capillary. So we take an example, which every textbook in the world has. The hydrostatic pressure at the arterial end of the capillary is 35 millimeters of mercury and approximately 15 millimeters of mercury at the venous end. This will vary with posture, whether the arterioles are constricted or dilated, and hydrostatic pressure decreases where arterial constriction. And in addition, there's a small tissue fluid pressure outside the capillary. So when you have hydrostatic pressure, go back. So basically, the hydrostatic pressure at this end is due, and although it's called hydrostatic pressure, I know, I'm not sure why that sort of lived for 100 years, but that's what it's called. But it is basically the pressure that is produced by the contraction of the heart. So that's the pressure. So it's actually blood pressure as you go down through the network. And of course, there's a bit of a drop, even though there's a ton of branching, from this end to this end. So it's 35 millimeters of mercury at this end, and 15 at this end. So that's the point. So you have pressure inside the capillary, and the effect of the pressure inside the capillary will be what? Function of, you've done some filtering in chemistry labs, you put some pressure, you've got some kind of stuff that looks kind of like milk, put it in some sort of a filter, you add the pressure to it, and of course the water comes through. Well, it's the same thing. You have hydrostatic pressure. There's a couple possible ways for water to move out of the capillary. And of course it does. So here's an example. Pressure here, hydrostatic pressure inside the capillary, pressure, and the fact that it's slightly permeable in a couple of instances, either through water channels or between the capillaries. You're going to lose water movement, you're going to cause more movement of water out of the capillary. So that's ultrafiltration. Okay, so if that was the case, you would lose an awful lot of water from the circulation into the interstitial spaces. But you don't want that. In fact, there's something else that prevents all this water from going out. And it's due to something called colloid osmotic pressure, also referred to in the textbooks as oncotic pressure. It comes from the Greek word onchosis, which means to swell. So it's either colloid osmotic pressure or oncotic pressure, and it's due to the plasma protein, the colloid osmotic pressure. The two proteins that are in the blood, and Dr. Bartman have told you about, are albumin and globulin. There's a couple of variations on some of the other things as well. So these guys are too big to get out of the capillary easily. Some of them move, but not much. All other particles diffuse rapidly, sodium ions, fluoride ions, potassium ions, whatever. So they have no osmotic pressure. Colloid osmotic pressure can be changed or is dependent on, or can be decreased if people have liver disease because they don't synthesize two plasma proteins. And you have various kinds of kidney disease where they actually filter the plasma proteins and they're treated in the urine so you can drop plasma proteins. If you do that, then the colloid osmotic pressure would decrease. But in normal individuals where none of these things occur, the plasma oncotic or colloid osmotic pressure is equivalent to about 25 millimeters of mercury. Interstitial fluid also has a small oncotic pressure because you lose some of the plasma proteins. They're outside the capillary. But we'll assume that it's approximately 0 at the arteriolar end and 3 millimeters of mercury at the end of, or the venial end. So here is the situation with the colloid osmotic pressure. It tends to draw fluid back into the capillary. So water movement would be the opposite direction. So put all of these things together, and if you look at every textbook in the world, it tells you that at this end of the capillary, the arteriolar end, there's a net filtration and some absorption back into the capillary at the end of the venial end because of the balance of the pressure. It changes. Hydrostatic pressure is high here, drops here, and the colloid osmotic pressure is almost constant across the capillary. Not totally constant, but it's close enough. That's the current view. The real story is probably one of these. This is the arteriolar end. This is the end of the venial, slightly different number here, not a big deal. Because if you get filtration over the entire length of the capillary, so you're losing fluid more at the arteriolar end and much less at this end here. So you're going to lose fluid all the time. The other thing is another example here showing if you have major constriction of the arterial, what you might do in hemorrhage, as everybody told me that wrote cardiovascular. Maybe we should leave it on for a while. More interesting than. Anyway, so if you constrict it, so you actually, as you might with somebody who has a lot of blood loss, and everybody told me that you get capillary refill. Yes, you do. For a period of time, you will get absorption into the capillary. So you're going to get fluid, water leaving from this part of the outside of the interstitial fluid. You do have some plasma proteins here, and eventually the two pressures are going to balance. So this kind of effect, even though it's very important in hemorrhage, is only transient. So as soon as you lose enough fluid from here, the two will balance and there'll be no flow. So that effect is always transient. It doesn't go on forever. But you do lose fluid from the interstitial spaces in cases when you get serious constriction of the capillary, or of the arterial, sorry. But this effect happens as transient. You do pick up some fluid. And I'm sure everybody's watched some war movies or westerns where a guy gets shot in the stomach or in the guts, And after a few, like 5-10 minutes, he wasn't very thirsty. Well, the idea is you're losing all the fluid from the interstitial spaces, and it's just a great sensation of thirst. So see some cowboy get shot in the stomach, laying there for about 10 minutes as I'm really thirsty. Well, the idea was you don't give him any water, but he's going to die anyway, so let him have some water. But the idea, this does happen. For all of you that told me it did happen. But this is only transient. It does add some fluid, maybe 600 to 800 mils, potentially, in the case, maybe a serious arterial constriction. So that's starting hypothesis. And what happens to the fluid that you actually lose under normal conditions? If you had no other mechanism, we'd all be walking around with huge legs. Pretty tough for some of the ladies with high heels. But anyway, you have something called a lymphatic system. And this is an example of a lymphatic capillary. They have valves, like the veins. And of course, the fluid gets picked up by the change back. Gets picked up by these guys, because they're very porous at the terminal ends. And they pick up the excess fluid. And they form what is called primary lymph. And primary lymph consists of water, small amount of plasma proteins, and all kinds of ions that are available. So primary lymph that gets filtered out gets into the lymphatic system. And that prevents swelling of the extremities. It's kind of important. And this is an example showing this lymphatic goes back into the circulation in the thoracic duct, and all this fluid is picked up, goes back, and it's approximately, in most normal sized human beings, about 8 liters a day. So if you have 8 liters of fluid in your legs, it's kind of hard to walk around. Anyway, that's a convective fluid. Of course, the other thing is that you get this free diffusion of everything across the capillaries. It goes in both directions, in and out. And of course, a lot of water. I think the glucose is a little overestimated, but this is pure diffusion, and it goes in and comes back out. So it goes in both directions. But the water, due to ultrafiltration, goes into the lymphatic system and gets back into the circulation and the thoracic duct. It goes back into the venous system. And that's water, small amount of plasma protein, and ions. Now, Dr. Saunders will point out eventually, you would expect that one of the areas where you have capillaries and the fluid exchange, the lung would not be a big issue because the hydrostatic pressure that goes from the right side of the heart, and the pressure is about 20 millimeters of mercury, so it's very low for having capillaries. You would expect none of this to occur, but in actual fact, lungs are very susceptible. Even though the capillary hydrostatic pressure is lowered, every time you breathe, you get a negative pressure, it tends to draw the water out. Dr. Saunders will point out, I'm sure. And the other thing that's really important, although these are continuous capillaries, the permeability to water is very high compared to muscle, and very, very high compared to brain. So the lungs are very susceptible to fluid buildup. And anyway, you probably noticed one of the things, the lymphatic system is kind of interesting. It has lymph nodes. These guys are located in various locations in the body, and they're great for picking up bacteria. Metastasizing cancer cells like to hang in there. And for example, somebody that's had major breast cancer surgery on, say, one side or the other, and of course the arms tend to swell because you don't have any, the lymph nodes are stripped out, they're gone, so you don't have any of this mechanism, and they tend to swell if you're sleeping or something, and that's kind of a serious problem. The other situation occurs in things like elephantitis, where you have parasites blocking the lymph nodes, reverses or the flow doesn't come back, so you get swelling of the legs. So the lymphatic system is quite important. And it sort of takes the excess fluid that's filtered out and takes it back into the normal circulation. We're now starting to get close to the end. The next section is going to be roughly on the control of the cardiovascular system. I think the last slide said, why do you need control of the cardiovascular system? Well, first one, of course, is exercise. You're running, your muscle needs blood, your heart needs more blood. You have to be able to increase the cardiac output and increase blood flow to specific places. Muscle, for example, in the heart. One of the ways you can do this several different ways. Temperature regulation is important. You want to close off the skin when it's really cold off so you don't lose heat. And if it's really hot, you want to open up the blood that's supplied to the skin so that you actually lose more heat. Changing posture. I don't think there's too many of us here, although I'm closer to many of you. When you get up early in the morning after a night out, and you get up really suddenly because you're late for the class, you don't faint. Cardiovascular system has mechanisms which allow you to do that. And of course, when you eat a nice steak, or whatever your choice is, Big Mac, or whatever that spicy hamburger is, or pushing it to A&W, or that meat ad. All the fluid that you need, the enzyme fluids and stuff that you get during the digestion, like saliva, all the fluids in the guts and stuff come from the circulation. They ultimately come from the blood. And you need to have a mechanism which allows you to increase blood flow to the stomach and the GI tract. And salivary glands is necessary. So there's a whole pile of things why you need to regulate the circulation. So normally you don't want to secrete a lot of stuff into the GI tract if you're not eating anything, and you do when you have food in the stomach, for example. So all the fluids are important in digestion, uptake, etc., ultimately come from the blood. In an old classical experiment, you all know what dogs like drool, food around. And the old classical experiment was that you took a dog, you had to anesthetize him in those days, and you stimulate the nerves to the salivary glands, and of course you get a ton of saliva from the dogs. And then you look at the hematocrit before and after, and the hematocrit stays around 45%. It'll go up with highly because we've lost fluid due to the secretion of saliva. So that's ultimately anything for digestion, absorption of fluids, ultimately comes from the blood. So you have to have a mechanism to turn this on. So that's why you need control of the cardiovascular system. The simplest is to control circulation flow rate, and you want to change cardiac output. The easiest way to do this, change cardiac output, is simply change heart rate. So if your heart's cranking away about 60 per minute, increasing that by a factor of 2, you probably increase cardiac output from 5 liters to about 8 liters, very easy. And that's simply by changing heart rate. And that may be something you do during exercise or fight or flight. Okay, so then basically cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. Assuming the stroke volume doesn't change, doubling the heart rate will double your cardiac output. The other way, of course, if you change something called preload. And preload, because it's sort of a historical approach, can be anything that measures how completely the ventricle fills. So at one time it was right atrial pressure because that was the easiest pressure to get a hold of, or to measure. It can be the volume at the end of diastole. But anyway, the only thing is you determine is it the pressure that determines how completely the ventricle fills. If the ventricle fills more completely, then of course that says it's increased preload and you get a larger stroke volume. So if the ejection fraction is about 50%, going from 140 to 200 will increase your stroke volume by 30 mils. And that's called preload. And you can measure it several different ways, or indicate it several different ways. So basically, it depends, for the left ventricle, it depends on the pressure at the end, just before a ventricle starts to contract, in the right atrium. That is preload. So if this is higher, the pressure here is higher, then when this valve opens, you will fill the ventricle more completely. And you have a range there where you can actually fill the ventricle from, say, 140 to 2 something below. So this all depends on the pressure just before the valve opens. Now I know the idea was right atrial pressure, and the point there was in fact what goes in here, since the circulation is in series, this is easy to measure, and it will eventually end up in here and fill the ventricle more completely. That's why it's called right atrial pressure. But really what it is it the pressure in this atrium that determines how completely this guy fills. If this is low, it won't fill very completely. If this is high, it fills more completely. You get more blood in there, you increase stroke volume. That's called preload. So if you plot this the old-fashioned way, stroke volume versus right atrial pressure or preload, would be left atrial pressure. As you increase preload, stroke volume increases. It's a concept. What changes preload? Well, one of the things when the heart contracts, it not only propels blood in the opposite direction, it's also a suction pump. So it actually fills the atrium more completely. So that's one of the things. So and if you contract more quickly, than you might during exercise, you get more blood flowing into the 2 atria, which eventually ends up in the left ventricle. The other thing, in the legs primarily, you have the large veins that contain about 60% of the blood volume under resting conditions. They're very distensible, so they contain a lot of blood. So the blood comes back because as the muscles contract, they push it up, and the valves are unidirectional. And you know you have valves in your veins. If you look at the back of your hand, and just press one spot and then just compress it, you see it goes away. There's no blood in there. But basically the idea is you have valves in your veins going in one direction. So the whole point is as the muscle contracts, squeezes the blood up, it can't come back because of the valve, and as it relaxes, it fills up with blood coming back from the extremities. This goes back into the inferior vena cava and fills the atrium more completely, so that will increase the preload in the right side, and it comes back to the lungs to the left side. So that's another factor of increasing preload during exercises becomes very important. So that's preload. And we'll go a couple of things I want to show you. The other determinant of cardiac rate is, of course, something called, as you believe, afterload. And afterload is basically the mean arterial pressure. So basically, as the ventricle contracts, you have to open the aortic valve, and where this valve opens, at what pressure this valve opens will determine how much blood you can pump up. So if the pressure here is very high, you're going to reduce the amount of blood that can actually be pumped by the ventricle. It's lower than it's more. So basically, preload is the pressure in the aorta, or afterload, sorry, is the pressure in the aorta. Called mean arterial pressure, and it has the effect of, as it increases for whatever reason, reducing cardiac output. Now, let me say this now. The left ventricle is not very susceptible to afterload. It's got a lot of muscle. The right ventricle, on the other hand, because of its skinny, much less cardiac muscle, is very susceptible to afterload. And this is some kind of diagram showing the effect of mean arterial pressure. Stroke volume, as the afterload increases in this direction, then the stroke volume will go down. As I said before, the left ventricle is not that susceptible to afterload. In the short term, not very susceptible. On the other hand, it's high blood pressure for 3 to 4 months. The left ventricle starts to get bigger, starts to hypertrophy, because it can't maintain this forever. But in the short term, not a big deal. Long term, yes. And this is just 2 examples showing the same thing. Again, this is mean arterial pressure as it goes up. Doesn't change much in the left ventricle. Of course, this is stimulation of sympathetic or parasympathetic. And as it goes down to around 108 millimeters of mercury, it will start to affect cardiac output. This is cardiac output. On the other hand, if you look at right atrial pressure or increasing preload, and it's got this sort of a curve of basically the operating range for most of us is in this range here. So we have a lot of reserve. This could be right atrial pressure, left atrial pressure, or end-diastolic volume of the ventricle. So these are in fact curves. Again, just being sympathetic stimulation, there's a lot of reserve there, or parasympathetic stimulation. So now we get into the other starving stuff. And that has to do with preload to some extent. And Starling's law, even though I think Vander kind of waffles about it, but this is basically the isovolumetric pressure developed by the heart muscle is proportional to the initial length of muscle to the length to the optimal. Cardiac output depends on end-diastolic volume, which is preload. Other factors are also involved: calcium sensitivity to myocardial, sensitive to myofibril, sorry. One of the things that is important is, of course, matches the outputs of the two ventricles. Precise balance between the two ventricles. And I told you this earlier. And in actual fact, on a beat-to-beat basis, the two ventricles can pump slightly different volumes of blood. But over 10 beats or so, the things have to normalize so that both sides pump the same amount of blood. Otherwise, you get fluid buildup usually in the lungs, but it could be elsewhere. So on a beat-to-beat basis, they don't pump the same volumes, but on 10 beats or so, they have to pump the same volume. They want fluid buildup. So this Starling's law basically gives you precise balance between the outputs to the right and left ventricle. And Starling's law, where it says that one of the things he suggested is the fact that as far as the length of the muscle fibers or the overlap of the actin myosin filaments, this being skeletal muscle, fairly broad, cardiac muscle operates roughly in the same shape. So you fill more, you get a better actin myosin overlap. One of the things. But there's a little bit of a problem with Starling. And of course, if you stretch it too much or you overfill it, of course, you break all the tight filaments. And this is the reason where you go into cardiac failure or heart failure. So you want to operate in this region here primarily. And that's where Starling's law sort of comes in. And this is a diagram you should put under your pillow. Starling's law indicates that if you, and the experiment was done a little differently than it is in us, he closes off the aorta and changes the volume. So there's no valve working. So the tension developed depends completely on the volume, or the pressure depends completely on the volume of the ventricle. But in all of us, we have a aortic valve which opens at roughly the blood pressure. So if you look at this pressure volume diagram, which we talked about earlier, this is the pressure, this is what the valve opens, the aortic valve opens. If there were no valve, then of course the pressure would rise substantially, and we meet this curve here eventually, which would be end systolic pressure. But before that happens, the valve opens. We have the isovolumetric contraction phase. The valve opens up to the aortic blood pressure, and of course you get ejection into the resistance, a bit of blood flowing in there, and it changes the pressure, increases the pressure, and eventually dies off because the T wave is roughly there. Most of the blood is pumped, and it intersects roughly there, and then you have isovolumetric relaxation. This is a little blip which is due to atrial contraction, so the P wave occurs here, the QRS complex roughly here, and the T wave roughly here. So basically, this is the original one we talked about earlier. Now, if you get more complete ventricular filling, as you might with preload, then of course it will fill more. This thing will expand a little bit, the T wave will be here, and basically It's a different kind of curve, and now the stroke volume is increased by this shaded area here. So that we just increased. So this is in effect the preload. So this is the original stroke volume, this is the new stroke volume. That's Starling's law. And the fact that the valve opens, it's only okay from this reading to this reading, because if it didn't open, the pressure would rise substantially more. This is kind of overblown a little bit. So Starling's law is okay for the isovolumetric contraction. Other than that, the valve comes into play. And by increasing preload, you increase this thing, this whole curve shifts to this direction, and the stroke volume, you change the stroke volume to that. So that's more complete ventricular filling. Now that is important for maintaining sort of the balance between the two ventricles, in addition to the fact that it's one way of increasing cardiac output. So let's say for the sake of argument, something's happened, we get more venous return. And rather than pumping 5 liters per minute, this guy here is pumping just a little bit more, 10% more or something. That's going to go through this side, through the pulmonary circulation, they're in series, and it comes back to the left side. So on the left side now, the preload is increasing. So this guy now is going to try and catch up and pump more blood. So that's the regulation that you have to maintain the same volume pumped by the two chambers over several beats. And one beat, this may pump more, this may pump less. So this depends on this preload effect. So if this pumps more, this eventually catches up. And you don't want, for example, fluid, if you take air, let's say 10 mils, and you're doing this for 1 minute. 10 mils, 60 beats, 600 mils is wall-lodged in the circulation. That pumps more than this for 1 minute. So you don't want to fill up the fluid here or here. And that's one example. So you have these two chambers have to pump approximately the same volume of blood. And that's part of the starting thing. That's actually the importance of it. Okay, we'll leave it there. Oh no, just one more thing. I have one more point there, I don't want to forget it. And the other way in which you can increase cardiac output is due to the effect of the two catecholamines, the adrenaline and noradrenaline, contract by changing the contractility. You change how strong the muscle contracts. So you change, for example, you increase L-channel turn, you also increase with noradrenaline and adrenaline, you also increase conduction velocity of the conducting pathways, and then that gives you stronger contractions and increases the stroke volume.